My dad comes from a small rural area in south central Virginia. In that part of the state, it feels like the two main family trees have the names Adams or Koger attached to them. Well, clearly, my dad's dad was a Koger, but my dad's mom was an Adams. Most years around Christmas, the Adams family, not connected to the TV show, gathers for the Adams family reunion, not connected to the movie. Several family members on my grandmother's side live less than a mile from each other to this very day. And this is very convenient when family comes to visit because originally there were 13 brothers and sisters that grew to 27 first cousins, that is now 60 plus second cousins, and who knows how many once and twice removed family members there are. Throughout my childhood, whenever we would go visit, we never saw just one member of my family. There was always 2 or 3 that would show up since they all lived together. Every visit to see my dad's family felt like a mini family reunion because everyone still lived within a few miles of each other. Everyone except my dad. My dad left home and went to college, which caused some people to scratch their heads, but this was okay because he was only 45 minutes away from home. But then, once he finished college, he got married and he moved to the foreign land of Kentucky, where he went to another school for not 1, but 2 degrees. And then, once he received those degrees, he didn't move back home to Bassett, Virginia, but he stayed in Kentucky and then moved to North Carolina and eventually back to Virginia, but still never home. He was the strange one in the family because he moved away from this place that was home for many generations, and he created a life separate from there. And while more and more of the generations that are my age and younger have moved away from Henry County, I know that for a long time there were a lot of questions about why my dad left home and didn't come back. Because for generations, people were born and raised and died within a 5-mile radius of one another. This concept of being born and raised and dying in the same place is becoming less and less common in our society. But I do know that there are several family units in our own congregation who have called Waynesboro home for their entire life. Some of you were born and raised here, and maybe you moved away, but you came back. Others of you knew folks who lived here, and you decided that when the time was right, you would call this place home. But I would say that for the majority of family units in our country, very few of them can say that their family has lived in the same place for multiple generations. Which brings us to our focal passage this morning. Today we're going back to the very beginning of our faith tradition. So far in the book of Genesis, a few things have happened. First off, God comes up with plan A, which is to create all of the things: animals and trees and people, mosquitoes, water, beluga whales, the stars, everything God has created. Not too long after this, the people God created decided that they wanted to live by their own rules, which causes God to respond with curses and punishment. But God also provides clothing to God's people. God doesn't give up on the people who were created from dust. Instead, God comes up with a plan B, and he sends the people out of the garden and into the world. But it doesn't take long for humanity to spin out of control again, which leads God to punish and destroy and to curse. But still, God does not give up. God comes up with a plan C. In Genesis 6, God saves one family. God provides security and shelter in the form of an ark, and humanity continues on. And now, a few generations after the flood, God is looking around and again is wondering, why are things still going wrong? But this time, God changes the approach. This time, instead of curses and punishment, God decides to bless and to promise. At the end of chapter 11, we are introduced to a man called Abram, who is a descendant of Noah. We don't know a whole lot about Abram. This is the first time we come across his name. We know who his father is and some of his male siblings, and we know that he has married a woman named Sarai who cannot have children. And we know that his family lives in the city of Haran. The very first verse of chapter 12 begins with a command from the Lord to Abram. God says, "Leave, we're going to a new place, and I will take you there." Again, in our culture, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. People pack up and move all the time. Some of us may keep the good packing boxes in our closets because, well, we want to have them on hand just in case. Some families only see each other 2 or 3 times a year. But back when this story was happening, people didn't just get up and move. Where you were born was where you would die. In Abram's time, people had a cyclical view of society and culture. Everything that had happened had already happened before, and it would all happen again. The cycle was set. The wheel in the sky keeps on turning. Everything stays the same. Up until this point, when we read scripture, the stories use language that include words like all the people of the earth or all of humanity. But at this point in the story, there is a break. Many Old Testament scholars say that the break between chapters 11 and chapter 12 is the most important break in the Old Testament. Many of the stories that we read in the first 11 chapters of Genesis are origin stories. We can find similar stories with similar themes in many other religions and cultures as humanity around the world has tried to make sense of how the world began. But as Abram and Sarai enter the narrative, we start to see a shift away from the collective story of humanity, and we begin to narrow our focus to the people of God, to our faith ancestors. And God is making a shift in the approach too. Instead of being frustrated with the world, God offers blessings and promise. God doesn't waste any time telling Abram what these blessings will be after he commands Abram to uproot his life and to venture into the unknown. I think that's more than fair. If God was going to ask me to leave everything I knew and go into a strange new land, I'd like to know what was going to happen once I got there, much like some of our children shared this morning. Theologian Rob Bell says that it has been his experience that when a person, no matter what their profession or calling, feels called to a new place, that there seems to be enough of a vision to give some shape and form, but not all of the details are spelled out. There is still a little risk and the need to take a leap of faith. And so we see Abram take this leap of faith. God tells Abram that he will be shown the way to the new land and that his offspring will become a great nation. But God doesn't tell Abram what the final destination is. There is still this element of faith and trust that God requires in the brand new journey. In this passage, God says the word bless or blessing 5 times. So what if God actually intended our world to be ordered by gifts and blessings and promises, and not chaos and curses and punishment? The promises that God offers Abram are ones that many of us hope for too: well-being and security, prosperity, and a place to call home. The goal of these promises is to show the people of God that their identity and their lives have a purpose that is present from the very beginning. This isn't just a random thing that happened. I think God intentionally picked these people to be the ones that broke the cycle and began a new journey. In verse 4, we read, Abram left just as the Lord told him. What made Abram so confident that all things would turn out for good? And what made God confident that Abram was the right person to send and to break the cycle? Well, that's the good thing about the God that we worship. This God is not a God who settles and dwells in just one place, but is a God who sojourns and moves us from our places of safety and barrenness into places of hope and life. This is a God who can work in and through all people. Abram begins his journey and takes his family with him. They leave Haran, which in Hebrew means crossroads. I feel like this is appropriate. I don't know which came first, the name of the city or the translation. But God's call and Abram's faithful response begin here at this crossroads, the very beginning of Israel's history. And on their journey, Abram and his family stop at Canaan, and Abram visits a sacred place called Shechem. God appears to Abram here, and Abram builds an altar and worships God. And then they continue on to Bethel, and again, Abram builds an altar and worships God. And there's a detour that we did not read where Abram and Sarai go to Egypt. It's fascinating, slightly disturbing. There's some sister wives situations happening, but that's for another Sunday. We pick back up at the end of chapter 13, and God says to Abram, look around. Everything that you can see is yours. In my head, I have the image of Mufasa and Simba looking down at the top of Pride Rock, and God, who sounds an awful lot like James Earl Jones, saying to Abram, look, Abram, everything the light touches is your kingdom. God invites Abram to walk around this land and to see everything that God is giving. And what does Abram do? Abram follows God, and when he arrives at Hebron, he builds an altar to the Lord and worships. All along this journey, Abram is first off trusting God, but second, he's marking where God shows up. He's not just pausing to take a selfie to post on social media. He's pausing, taking intentional time to gather rocks and branches and to worship. Abram is creating these altars as a way to remind himself and his family God was here. But I wonder if when other people came across these altars, if they knew what they were for. The majority of the people in this time worshiped multiple gods. And I wonder if Abram found a way to make these altars different, to set them apart, to find a way to say that these were altars to Yahweh, the God of Israel, to show others that God is here, and God is there, and God is everywhere. So this story isn't as simple as maybe it first appears. It's not an easy story of following God and going to a new place. It's a story about breaking cultural norms, leaving everything you know, and journeying from a place of what is known to a place of risk. It is about being where you are and doing that wholeheartedly. Today we have celebrated our graduates. We have acknowledged all of the things they have accomplished, and we have acknowledged that they have done a lot of hard work. We have shared what they plan to do next, even if what they do next is still to be determined. But even though they don't know every step of their journey and what they will discover, I think all of us can agree that our hope and prayer is that wherever their journey takes them, God will walk before them, will walk alongside them, and will come behind them, surrounding them with the faithful presence and guidance that journeyed with Abram and Sarai as they set out to begin the rest of their lives. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the book, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. It's a pretty popular book to give to graduates to remind them that they can and will do great things. But I think some of these words could have also been shared with Abram and Sarai as they began their journey. So I've decided to rewrite part of this book and to share this version for us as we are gathered here today. Congratulations, today is the day. You're off to great places. You're off and away. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your sandals. Those unknowns you will face, God's ready to handle. You will come to a place where the road is unclear, Maybe you'll meet friends, and from others you'll steer clear. It won't always be easy. I'm sorry, it's true. The mess-ups and hiccups will happen to you. You may find yourself in a far and distant land, and you may say to God, "This is what you have planned?" You might feel alone, and there's a very good chance you'll meet things that will scare you right out of your pants. You may find on the road between here and not quite there that there are so many things that do not compare to the places you know and feel comfortable and safe, but sometimes there are new things that you'll have to face. Whether your name is Emma or Patrick, Brooks, Jalen, or Athena, trust and believe that your God will lead you to the places that are filled with opportunities unknown, and years down the road, you'll realize how much you've grown. Just remember that as you continue on the way, to listen for God's call, and God will never stray. The first call that happens in the Bible is when God calls creation into being, and the second is this one, when God calls Abram into a different kind of community. God calls from a community that is no longer listening, that is experiencing emptiness and coldness, and a community that has no hope. And God calls Abram into a community that has a future, even when that future is unknown. The focus of this story is not on Abram's past, but on who Abram can become and oh, the places he'll go. The promise that God speaks of is already present. God is just calling it out and speaking it into being. We meet Abram at Haran, at a crossroads. I wonder what crossroads you find yourselves at these days, and which way your path is taking you. Each of us is called to serve the world in our own unique ways, but as followers of Jesus, we are called to love God and to love our neighbor. Our lives are a continuous journey of becoming. It never stops. The constant part of this journey is that we should never and we will never journey alone. There are others on this same journey with us, and we are all united by the God who leads, loves, and guides. In just a few moments, we will gather at the table and we will remember the journey of those who came before us. We will be joined with the great cloud of witnesses as we share a meal together. We remember that as the disciples gathered at the table with Jesus, they weren't entirely sure where this journey would lead. They listened to the voice of Jesus calling them out of their boats and into life and relationship with him, but even then they didn't know what they were saying yes to. And now they are gathering for one last time at a table at yet another crossroad. But this meal was just the beginning. It was the beginning of a new way of living, of a new covenant between God and God's people, between God and each of us. It was a reminder that wherever we go in the world, God is there. When we take communion, we remind ourselves that God's love has been set loose on the world, and it's our responsibility to be carriers of that love wherever God calls us. As we prepare to take communion and our deacons come forward to serve, I invite you to reflect on where God is calling you to serve and to go in the world. The same God who called Abram and Sarai is the God who calls us. All we have to do is be willing to listen and to trust where God leads. May we be faithful followers on the journey and be willing to discover all the places we will go.